Hi, I'm Ahmed Shahabuddin, and you're in the stream. Today, Mongolia. A protest that began in the city center of the capital, Ulaanbaatar, has now mostly moved online and has become known as the Do Your Job movement. We'll talk to Mongolians to better understand what exactly the youth are demanding and why. "30 years after the fall of communism, Mongolia has experienced a series of protest movements around issues ranging from air pollution, voting, mining, and the economy. Most notably and recently, protests against the mistreatment of COVID-19 patients, which eventually led to the shock resignation of the Prime Minister. Mongolia is a landlocked country in East Asia, bordered by Russia to the north and China to the south. With a population of just over 3 million, it's also one of the world's most sparsely populated nations. In early April, young Mongolians gathered in Ulaanbaatar Square for 2 days of peaceful demonstrations. They demanded changes to the economy, taxation, more jobs, and a plan to reduce high rates of inflation. While the protests ended a few weeks ago, the Do Your Job movement still lives online. The global pandemic has also devastated Mongolia. In 2020, it closed its borders, shut down businesses, and banned all international travel. As a result, the economy suffered its worst decline since the 1990s, and more than 250,000 people fell into poverty. Now, you add to that the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine, and inflation, food shortages, and fuel prices are all skyrocketing. Now, that's because Mongolia is almost entirely dependent on neighboring Russia for its energy. That's a lot to discuss today, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Jar Zardahan, the Greater Central Asia editor at Global Voices. Also, Anand Tumurtauga is a journalist in Ulaanbaatar, and Hulan Jukder is a journalist and host of the Media Podcast. And for those of you joining us on YouTube Live, put your comments in the questions in the YouTube chat, and we'll bring those to our guests on the show. Anand, I want to start with you, with the basics. You were there in the square. You were covering this story a few weeks ago when the youth really gathered there physically. What were they actually demanding? And since then, has anything changed?
And thanks for having me on the show, first of all. The youth were basically demanding, as you said it, they want to live in Mongolia. They wanted to see a better future in Mongolia. And most, as you've seen, all of those banners and slogans, they have banners saying, I want to live, I want to live, I want to live in my country, I want to dream of living in my own country. That is basically the central message of this protest, that the youth demanded that their lives are way too hard and there's just no prospects for the future to live in Mongolia, basically, yeah.
And you know, we're looking at some of those images that you took right now as you're talking, and Zar, you were nodding as we heard from Anand. Do you agree? I mean, this felt like it was a moment, that it was significant, but what is new about this, or is anything new about this?
Thank you for having me here. The most important thing is that Mongolia has a culture of protests, political protests, and the same square, Ulaanbaatar Square, is very prominent, the most important spot, because both the parliament and the seat of the president and the prime minister, they're located in the same building. So it's a very convenient place to protest. And as you also mentioned, last year there have been the protests which basically led to the resignation of the prime minister.
Right.
He is the president now, so he knows well how the protests are important. The different thing this time was that youth were traditionally not very active in political life. The voting turnout is very low compared to elderly or any other age groups. And usually also traditionally they vote against something specific, for example, COVID treatment and so on. And often there are certain political groups or parties behind them. This time it turned out to be that the youth went there on their own, the least active, politically active group. They didn't have any political backing organization behind them, and they had basically broad list of demands. As you could also see from the posters and what they have, there are so many topics.
Right,
so
right.
It's very difficult to put them in.
And we'll get to the very different demands and the many demands that they have. But before we do that, Hulan, I saw you nodding as our first two guests were speaking and explaining to us what was going on. Why do you think the youth sort of took to the streets this time? And do you think that there's hope that some of their demands might be met?
Well, I think the protest was about the unequal opportunities and the that are given to the young people in Mongolia. It was not just about like inflation related to the COVID-19 situation. It was about also about like they demand equal opportunity to study or like for education and social insurance policies and everything. So I would say that. And also the new thing for me was that, group of youth participation for the election was really low. It has been, but they're on the square and demanding what they need was like really new because even though their participation for the election is low, their engagement or like their participation in the society is also back. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing up that point. We actually have a video comment that was sent to us from Dolgyan, someone who works for an independent research institute in Mongolia, about this very issue, how the youth have struggled historically to kind of have a real impact on decision-making. I see you're nodding, Anand. We'll come to you at the back of this.
Historically, the young people in Mongolia have been able to influence decisions. A clear example is the fact that the democratic revolution itself was led by young people. But today, young people have very limited opportunities to influence decisions. In our recent polls, we asked the youth themselves why. More than 70% said they lack financial resources, they lack political experience, but more importantly, they lack support from the society, from the political parties, and even from their own families. They feel they are not respected and they are not taken seriously by the society. Yet, the youth are the least satisfied age group in Mongolia in terms of political, economic, social, and environmental, all aspects. So whether these recent economic youth protests will lead to any change, I think they will incentivize the government, other younger generation, and especially the political parties to have more youth-friendly agenda.
So, Anand, the youth have been activated and engaged, but what's going to come of this? What do you make of that comment?
Yes, I agree with that comment full-heartedly, and I would like to add on that when I was at the square, there was a lot of elderly or people who are older. That they told me that this is what they've chosen, basically, that you live what you sow, basically, like you reap what you sow, and they should have been. And one older lady told me that they should have voted for their own rights. Now they're living with the consequences. But I would like to add that on that is that Mongolian youth again are not represented, and I think in 2016 the Duke University did a study on people's preferences on voting, and in that many people don't vote on the specifics of economics, like they don't vote on policies, and they vote on identity. Like our current politicians, our current parties do not represent any kind of identities of the Mongolian youth. They basically have separated themselves from the younger groups that are struggling, basically.
Right. And I think that separation is part of this, right? I mean, it's not uncommon when you see these sort of popular uprisings in any country. Hulan, we often see people wanting to overthrow the government or to remove people from power. This is really about having the government be held accountable to do their jobs. And in terms of holding the government accountable, we've also seen calls recently since the protests to hold the police accountable for police brutality and some allegations that have been coming out when these videos have been surfacing of police on that night, in the middle of the night, around 4 a.m., attacking and beating some of the protesters, as you can see in this footage. Hulan, we often see a disconnect between generations in any country, right? In terms of the demands that they want for a better future in society. But I'm curious, even though this is being led by the youth, how can this actually materialize into change for all citizens in Mongolia? Are you optimistic that this will grow as a movement? And that change will happen?
Well, yeah, I'm not really sure. And, also,
I was going to say that yes did not sound very convincing.
Yeah, one thing that I would like to add on Anand's comment was like, I've seen quite a few posts on social media that, young people are demanding, something, but you need to go and vote, they said. But, we have like 3 political parties which are really active, and one is quite small. And, majority of the parliament is actually the one party. And, when there is election, it's young people say that there is no choice, So all we can do is just demanding, do your job better. And also, Dolgan's comment was really right. Young people are not taken really seriously. Those political parties think that young people, like number of the young people, is just a number of the voters, group of voters. But actually, number of young people, they're actually moving the country, so they need to be taken seriously.
Yeah, and when we talk about things that need to be taken seriously and the reason they need to be taken seriously, we have a comment in our YouTube live chat box here from Yosef El Taraifi saying, the country is going to be depleted of young people. There will be a brain drain, essentially, if they don't listen to their demands. Now, switching gears to kind of whether or not this is going to have a real impact, we have a video comment from someone named Manlai who is kind of commenting on their lack of faith in any real lasting impact from these very, very many demands. Let's take a listen.
Mongolian young people, just like everywhere else, they want to have a better life, stable income, living wages, and they want to live in generally well-off society. But these needs and demands are quite abstract and inconcrete. The abstraction of the needs and lack of consensus was quite evident during the protests, where, for example, some would call for increase in wages and other social benefits, while others would call for complete disappearance of the state in dealing with people's everyday life. The so-called 7 demands, later turned into 15 demands, was delivered by someone who was associated with youth wing of the ruling party, and in the end, the 15 demands looked a lot like general plans of the current government. So, in my opinion, I don't think this protest will have any significant impact on actual policy changes. Only positive outcome I see is that it has activated youth as a social and political group, and hopefully they will continue their fight in the future.
So, Jar, I want to ask you, after you hear that comment, and after you look at this headline from Manlai, who we just heard from there, saying why Mongolia can't and won't produce broad mass movements. Do you agree that despite the youth being activated, that it's not realistic that we'll see any lasting impact?
I think one thing I should add is to the previous comment, and both to Anand and Hogan, is that Mongolia is a very young country. The median age is slightly below 30, and it is a country where the young people make up the great chunk of the population. But the problem, and I also share what Manlai said, there is some kind of despair, hopelessness to some extent. If, for example, I am based in Kazakhstan, and we had the the bloody and protests which led to hundreds of deaths, which basically took the streets of the whole country in different cities. And compared to that, in all the protests, what I could sense reading all the posters and slogans is some kind of a hopelessness, to some despair, not anger, like in case of our country.
Yeah.
So talking about the brain drain is that one of the major motors was what is called this we want to live well in Mongolia, in our country.
Yeah.
And there have been many videos on social media of people would say that I could leave the country, I have an education, I have possibilities, but we don't want to do that. We want to transform this country. And there was a sense of misgivings that things are not going well, specifically for young people.
And you know, when you say things are not going well specifically for young people, I think it's worth mentioning for our audience, for those who maybe don't know, that's a very large proportion of the population. At more than 1 million in a country of just over 3 million, I mean, youth aged 15 to 34 represent the largest demographic group in the country. And when you think about that, you know, we see, I personally have some experience. I've been to Mongolia, and I bring this up because I was very impacted by not only its beauty, but the frustration, especially amongst young men. I was working on a documentary where we were looking at how they were redefining masculinity just 30 years after communism fell, you know. And it seems like there's a reverse gender gap also in Mongolia, which is quite rare, where a lot of young women might have jobs or might be more stable or secure. And so I'm curious, you know, just what can you share with our audience, Anand, about this question of whether these concerns are too general, whether these demands are too general? We heard from Jar, you know, we didn't see the kind of mass deaths and violence that we saw in the protests in Kazakhstan a few months ago. Are you optimistic that despite the dependence on Russia, that there's a way out of this crisis?
So I also have a very a dark notion, basically, that there isn't much there isn't any kind of resolve, I would say, that the government can do, because it's almost like a bubble, and it burst, and there's no way of fixing it, because this has been building up for a very long time. I would say from the beginning of when Mongolia became a democracy, there was issues of welfare issues, low wages for workers, and also, again, you talked about particularly about men, about our masculinity, about who we are as Mongolian men. That is a big issue. Because
why is that such a big issue? I mean, I know that traditionally there was a very narrow sense of what a man needs to do and be. You know, he needs to wrestle, he needs to be able to ride horses. What's the issue? I mean, I know that sounds a bit cliche, but it does stem from a very kind of rigid view of the role of man in society. Am I wrong?
For me, I think the issue stems from when Mongolia transitioned from a communist country to a democracy. We lost most of the how can I say, like the blue collar jobs or the factory workers, basically the proletariat or what have you, the people who are working. That class of that specification of men have become lost. So there's basically three Mongolian men. There's the one that is who is like a super rich businessman. Yeah. And there's the Mongolian who lives in the countryside, and the third is the Mongolian who is a strongman, who's like a wrestler. So those are the only three images that they're perpetuated in our society. And again, as I talked about identity, it's just not many Mongolian men cannot be all those three things. It's very difficult.
Right, and you know, all this, not to cut you off, but all this, Anand, really begs the question if the government and the decision makers are ever really going to be receptive and willing to actually listen to the youth, especially if their demands might not be very specific or as organized as some critics say that it can be. And with that in mind, I do want to share on YouTube, we have Xander F. in our chat asking or bringing up a point about this, saying, I feel that the impact is informed by how open to criticism and listening to their plight the government will be. We also have a video comment, one more that I think is worth going to. When we talk about solutions, Hulan, when we talk about what to do about this, now that this has happened, now that the conversation is continuing online in Mongolia, let's listen to what Zol Jargal had to say, and then we'll come to you, Hulan.
Contrary to the politicians' hollow promises, the protest slogans had real strong resonance. And in this sense, implicitly, the protests revealed the impotence of the state to confront structural crisis.
So, Hulan, your thoughts? I saw Anand seem to agree as he was nodding as she made her point. What do you think, Hulan?
Well, I would like to go back to the previous comment. Since the 1/3 of the population of the country is youth.
Yeah.
I hope that things will be changed, of course, but I don't know how and why or when. But for example, this protest, for example, it's the activeness of the youth engagement, like their participation. And also, since the country is young, it doesn't matter, we see that, slightly bit of rise in the number of the decision-making positions of young people.
Sure.
So since the 1/3 of the population is youngsters, they, of course, will participate in the society and also run for the office as well.
Right.
So I think that would be the little hope of things
and,
will be.
And not to broaden this out of Mongolia, but in so many issues or flashpoints in any country around the world, it's so often the case, right, that the youth are either sidelined or feel as though they have no voice or are not being taken seriously, even if they are a disproportionately larger number of the population. So one thing that perhaps, if you're watching this, you have in common as a young person, if you're watching with people in Mongolia. Before we go, I do want to just ask, this energy issue because of the pandemic, and then we have this invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Mongolia, for those who don't know, is entirely dependent, essentially, on Russia for its energy supplies. Jar, how difficult do you think the situation is going to be if this war continues? How affected will Mongolia be?
Basically, the pandemic and the aftermath hit Mongolia quite heavily, both in terms of imports and exports, and specifically for a country which exports coal and other minerals to China, and the one which is basically entirely almost dependent on energy resources from Russia. The last few years, and I would say this is partially basically the background, all this despair, when the world started opening up after the pandemic. That's what the expectation, because the country was closed, travel was closed, tourism and trade were declined. There was a hope that probably this is the time that things will get better. But the new restrictions in China and the closing of borders and the war in Ukraine hit Mongolia specifically. And this is the country which has only two borders, either Russia or China, and imports energy from one and sells, for example, coal, copper, other minerals to the other, raw materials mainly. And basically it was a double hit, and things are not going well financially and politically. And in recent years, Mongolia got involved in this China-Russia energy deals.
And there's so much more to discuss about the geopolitics of it all and all the different reasons. I do want to thank you. We're out of time for today, so thank you for joining us, to our guests, and for you at home. See you next time.